When you think of Rio de Janeiro, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the Christ the Redeemer statue with open arms, Sugarloaf Mountain at sunset, the Copacabana beach full of colorful umbrellas, and people relaxing with a coconut water in hand. These images seem straight out of a postcard, and in a way, they are. Just as we've shown the B-side of other places, today will be no different. Today we land in Brazil, specifically in Rio de Janeiro, to take you on a tour of a side that doesn't appear in tourism ads. Number 1. The postcard image. What is Rio de Janeiro, if seen through the world's eyes? Rio is practically the definition of a postcard, a city seemingly designed to enchant the eyes. From the outside, it may have its problems, and we'll talk about them. But first, it's essential to understand what makes Rio so admired. And let's be honest, Rio knows how to sell itself. It's almost a global brand. Christ the Redeemer, Sugarloaf Mountain, internationally famous beaches, and of course the song The Girl from Ipanema, that made the whole world sing bossa nova. It's a collection of symbols that not only represent Rio, but also the carioca vibe of freedom, party, and natural beauty that the whole world wants to experience. And if there's one thing Rio knows how to do, it's throwing a party. Carnival is undoubtedly the largest open-air show on the planet. In February, the Sambadrome turns into the most vibrant stage in the world, with samba schools parading in a spectacle of colors, costumes, and music that mesmerizes both Brazilians and foreigners. But Rio isn't just about landscapes and parties. The cuisine is a show in itself. The classic feijoada, mixing tradition and flavor, is almost a ritual. There's also the famous Globo biscuit, with iced mate on the beaches of Copacabana and Ipanema, the bean broth served in bars, and so many other delights that have become part of the itinerary for anyone visiting the city. Rio de Janeiro breathes music: samba, funk, bossa nova. It doesn't matter the rhythm, the laid-back style, and the carioca swing make anyone want to tap their feet. It's the soundtrack of a city that refuses to stand still. And it's not an exaggeration to say that Rio even conquered Disney. Yes, directly from the streets of Rio was born Zé Carioca, the famous parrot full of charm and mischief that became the biggest symbol of Brazil in the world of animated films. The most curious part is that he was created by Walt Disney himself. Yes, Walt himself visited Brazil in 1941, and during his stay at the iconic Copacabana Palace Hotel, the idea of bringing this character to life came up, capturing the essence of the Carioca way. Zé Carioca made his official debut in the 1942 film Saludos Amigos. The movie was divided into 4 parts, each showing aspects of South America. And of course, Brazil stood out in the plot. Donald Duck arrives in Rio de Janeiro and is greeted by Zé Carioca, who turns into a sort of tour guide. But like any good carioca, Zé didn't just show the sights. He introduced samba, the famous sidewalk, and even cachaça, the famous Brazilian drink. Together, Zé and Donald stroll through Rio to the sound of Tico Tico no Fuba, one of the most famous Brazilian songs of the time. But at the same time, this city hides very serious problems, some literally behind these beautiful landscapes, and that's what we need to talk about. Number 2. Upscale neighborhoods and favellas. Side by side. One thing that shocks anyone arriving in Rio de Janeiro for the first time is the absurd contrast between luxury and necessity. On one side, modern buildings, million-dollar apartments, and tree-lined streets. On the other, entire hillsides filled with houses stacked almost balancing on top of each other. It seems like a movie set, but it's Rio's reality, and we're not talking about distant neighborhoods or far-off suburbs. Here, the social abyss is literally side by side. The most emblematic example of this is Rocinha. It's not only the largest favela in Rio de Janeiro, but also a symbol of this contrast. Located less than 6 kilometers from Leblon, one of the city's most expensive areas, Rocinha is a living representation of the social abyss that defines Rio de Janeiro. Just cross a few streets, and you go from one of the most expensive areas of the city directly to the largest favela in Brazil. But don't think this is a peculiarity of Rocinha alone. In Rio de Janeiro, this logic repeats throughout the city. There are over 1,000 favelas scattered across the hills, home to about 1.5 million people, representing about 22% of Rio's population. Yes, 1 in 5 Rio residents lives in a favela. And if you think the emergence of these favelas was a geographic coincidence, think again. This story has an origin that few people know, and as strange as it may seem, France has everything to do with it. Number 3. The origin of favelas. The favelas of Rio de Janeiro did not appear out of nowhere. They have deep roots in the history of a city that tried at all costs to transform into the Paris of the tropics. In the early 20th century, Brazil was experiencing the fervor of the newly proclaimed republic, and preparing for the centennial of independence. Rio, which was the capital of the country, needed to impress the world. And what was the model of inspiration? Paris, of course. The urban reform of Paris, led by Georges-Eugène Haussmann under Napoleon III, was a revolution. Between 1853 and 1870, narrow streets and old buildings gave way to wide boulevards, modern buildings, and a sewer system praised to this day. But this spectacle of modernity had a very high social cost. Thousands of people were evicted from their homes without any alternative housing. And it was precisely this formula that Brazil tried to copy, with an even more dramatic result. In 1903, then-Mayor Pereira Passos, with the support of President Rodrigues Alves, initiated a major urban reform in Rio. The goal was clear: erase the city's colonial image, open wide avenues, modernize the infrastructure, and create an environment that would impress the international elite. But for that, there was one detail needed: removing the people living in the center. And so, the cortiços, large houses divided into small rooms, rented to poor families, were demolished. The residents, without compensation or any kind of support, were evicted overnight without alternatives. These people migrated to the hills and outskirts near the center. This is how the first favelas began to emerge. And if you think the story ends there, you're mistaken. Because as if exclusion and pushing people to the hills weren't enough, the emergence of favelas brought a new problem. A problem that still defines Rio's daily life and makes headlines: organized crime. Number 4. Organized crime. If there's one thing everyone has heard about Rio de Janeiro, it's the constant noise. But this time, we're not talking about music or samba. Gunshots, police operations, and faction disputes are part of the ambient sound for those living in the favelas. And don't think this is a soap opera or sensationalist news. This is the daily reality for thousands of people. But what few people ask is how Rio got to this point. Remember we said that favelas began to emerge when workers, without alternatives, climbed the slopes of the hills and built their makeshift homes? Well, at first these places were composed of only humble homes. But things began to change in the 1970s. This was when drug trafficking entered the favelas, and the spark came from an unlikely place: Ilha Grande prison. During the military dictatorship, political prisoners were placed to live with common criminals. It may seem like a simple administrative decision, but the result was devastating. The political prisoners taught tactics of discipline, hierarchy, and organization. The criminals learned quickly and used this knowledge outside the cells. What was once just a gang turned into something much more powerful: criminal factions. This is where names that everyone knows today originated: Comando Vermelho, Terceiro Comando, and other groups that, in the beginning, were just local gangs, but over time became true paramilitary organizations. They control territories, manage drug trafficking, and impose their own laws within the communities. And the situation only gets worse. Number 5. Waves of crimes. When it comes to urban violence, Rio de Janeiro is always at the top of global rankings, and not in a positive way. Numbeo, one of the largest platforms for data on security and quality of life, placed Rio in 4th place among the most dangerous cities in the Americas. That's right, more dangerous than Los Angeles, Bogota, Cancun, and even Medellin, a city that for years was the biggest symbol of violence on the continent. If this data isn't enough, the numbers of shootings reveal the severity of the problem. Between July 2016 and July 2017, more than 3,800 shootings were recorded in Rio's communities. That's an average of 39 shootings per month, practically one shooting per day. And believe me, the situation hasn't improved since then. According to the Crossfire Institute, which monitors gunfire, the scenario has become even more tense. From January to October 2024, 2,165 shootings were recorded in the Rio metropolitan area. Of this total, 795 occurred during police operations, meaning confrontations between the police and criminal factions. And if you think the problem is confined to the favelas, reality shows otherwise. Many of these deaths didn't happen in hidden alleys and corners. Some of the most shocking scenes occurred in the city's affluent areas. One of the most impactful cases was the murder of 3 orthopedic doctors on the beach of Barra da Tijuca, one of the richest and busiest neighborhoods in Rio. But Rio's reputation for violence didn't just arise because of drug trafficking. Number 6. Trafficking, militias, and the complex web of crime. If you think the biggest violence problem in Rio de Janeiro comes solely from drug trafficking, you're very mistaken. Because in addition to the factions that dominate the favelas, there is another power growing in the shadows: the militias. These groups don't appear armed with rifles in the streets. They control from the shadows, and that's where the danger lies. Unlike traffickers, militias don't need to show their weapons all the time. They infiltrate daily life, control services, and dictate the daily routine of those living in the communities. It may seem exaggerated, but pay attention. Militias sell gas cylinders, charge protection fees, control clandestine cable TV signals, and even the internet that reaches homes. If you live in an area controlled by militias, you only buy gas and the internet from those they command. No choice. And don't think they act alone. They also control political power. Several politicians have been identified as allies or financed by militias. That's right, they finance campaigns and then demand returns, making decisions that serve their interests and keeping their businesses intact. And there's still another aspect: organized crime within the police. Number 7. Corruption and the police. When we talk about police in Rio de Janeiro, the subject becomes even more delicate. Here, police corruption isn't just a problem, it's a central part of the crime dynamics. And this goes beyond Rio. Corruption has roots throughout Brazil, but in Rio, the situation is more evident. The police force itself is divided. On one side, officers trying to do an honest job, and on the other, those who are directly involved with crime. This isn't just a suspicion, it's a reality confirmed by countless investigations and trials. Officers who receive bribes to release traffickers, who participate in extortion schemes, and who directly involve themselves in crimes. It's an ingrained problem, making the work of honest officers even more challenging. And don't think this is just something recent. This goes back decades. The Marielle Franco case, for example, revealed an entire network of police officers involved with militias. It's a tragic story of a councilwoman who was murdered in 2018 for denouncing police violence and militia actions in favelas. In conclusion, if you plan to visit Rio de Janeiro, don't be discouraged by its dark side, but be aware that, like any large city, there are layers and complexities that go beyond the postcard image. Rio is a city of contrasts, where beauty and chaos coexist in a dance that is both fascinating and disturbing. Understanding these contrasts is essential to truly appreciate the unique spirit of this incredible city.